Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for joining me here. Happy Friday to you all. It's our last show here of the week. We have a lot to go through to conclude the week and get you all prepared for the weekend in both the NFL and college football. Something that I like to do, and I think I'm going to continue to do as both the NFL and college football seasons go on, is look at some of the best games from each week in games which I believe will have the biggest fantasy implications. So not necessarily the best games, but just games that I feel like will affect and impact your fantasy football decisions for that specific week. We'll do it today as well in both the NFL and college football. And since we aren't necessarily a weekend show, I do want to get a little bit of input to you guys in terms of Sunday night football as well. And then we also will have a high risk, high reward segment in terms of players who I think can be boom or bust this week. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you guys to consider liking, subscribing, and following the show in the network as a whole. Also, you guys have been doing a fantastic job of this as well. Keep on making yourselves available to it. The Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube are a great way to interact with the show, a great way to get your comments on air. If you really want your comments to get on air, use the Super Chat feature where you can leave a tip or donation as well, and it will pop up immediately on my screen and I will shout you out as well as your comment. So if you're interested in doing that, any way you want to, question, comment, or concern, it is greatly appreciated by both me, my fellow podcasters, this show especially, and the network. So it's just something for you to consider. But without further ado, let us jump right into today's show. Starting off with the aforementioned segment that I wanted to start today's show with, the NFL games that I believe will have the biggest fantasy implications for this week. Now, like I said, these aren't the marquee matchups. Some of them are of the week, but they're just the ones that I feel like will reveal a lot of different storylines about certain players in terms of their fantasy implications. And so, without further ado, let's jump right in with the first game of the week that we'll be talking about, and we'll be talking about a lot throughout the show. That is the Sunday night football matchup is Bills-Ravens. And I think that the big question that I gather from this game is, will the QBs carry the day? Because I think about this game, and I think about how both of these offenses will go up against these defenses, because there are a lot of questions in those units and not necessarily about these offensive units. On the Bills side, their offense is looking to be clicking. Everything seems to be going right for it. Josh Allen is playing the best football of his career. His many role player weapons are stepping up into their new roles as either a wide receiver one like Khalil Shakir or a guy like James Cook who's just getting a lot more touches in this offense. And it's paying dividends for them. Joe Brady, my early coordinator pick of the year, if that is such a thing, because of the way he's truly impacted this offense. On the Ravens side of things, their offense hasn't necessarily looked as good, but from what I saw of them last week and what King Henry did to the Dallas Cowboys, I'm now buying into what this offense can become. Because I was a very skeptical person when it came to Derrick Henry's value to this team and what he would be able to bring to it. But what he showed me last week, albeit against a very porous Cowboys run defense, did prove that at least he has some merit in this offense. But when I look at the defensive side of the ball, the Bills, on one hand, are doing more with less, but it very well could come tumbling down for this defense as well. Up to this point, they played very well, but they really haven't had much issue with any specific team. Yes, their performance against the Dolphins was perhaps one of the most impressive defensive performances of the season because of the way they limited both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle in that game. But I kind of take that with a grain of salt because it was what was going to be expected for that defense in the game. It was what they needed to do in order to mitigate for some deficiencies there as well. But the deficiencies are still there. Their linebacker core is still weakened because of the loss of Milano. Terrell Bernard got injured during the season, kind of playing through that a little bit. So that's something to note. So this game is really going to be dictated by which QB takes over. I'm more confident in that being Josh Allen, just from what I've seen, as he's both a runner and a passer this season. So I would say if you're a fantasy football manager and you have your pick of guys at the QB position that you want to start, Josh Allen would be the play here, should he be on your roster. But Lamar as well, look for him to try and affect this game more as a rusher than as a passer, because I feel like that's the best way to attack this Bills defense thus far, because I feel like the Bills secondary is its strength, but you can attack the linebackers in many different ways. Stretch them out, stretch the field a little bit. So look for Lamar to do that with his legs. But overall, I think this game will be really intriguing in terms of which QB really is going to take over this game. And for now, I think it's Josh Allen. But just because of Lamar's dual threat ability, I think that this could be an interesting QB conundrum for fantasy football managers everywhere. But the next game I want to talk about is kind of an under-the-radar game. We talked about this game a little bit in yesterday's show, but not to the extent I want to get into now. And that is Rams-Bears. And the question that I have about this game is, what with the depleted nature of the Rams roster, yes, they eked out a win against San Francisco against all odds. Can a Bears defense that seems to be going a little bit too under the radar really take the advantage in this game? And if so, will the Bears defense be a popular play for fantasy football managers? Because like I said, defenses, this is the year of them, right? But a lot of people are still looking to stream their defenses for such a game. And so if you're kind of looking through the market for your defense right now, look to the Bears. I'm not saying that the Rams can't, pull off a miracle again, but I wasn't necessarily as impressed with the Rams offense, more so than I was disappointed in the 49ers in that game closing it out, because the 49ers had a unique opportunity to close out that game, but they had a couple missed field goals. They didn't click late in the game in the red zone, so that was more of the reason why the Rams had that opportunity. I wasn't impressed. Yes, Kyron Williams had perhaps his best game, but that was kind of a force. He needed to have a game like that because none of those offensive weapons really had anything going. And for what it's worth, I still think guys like Tutu Atwell, Colby Parkinson, and DeMarcus Robinson can add value. But against a Bears defense that I feel like we're underappreciating right now just because of the deficiencies of their offense, I feel like this game could be more of a defensive slugfest than people think. So look for the Bears to be a sneaky kind of play in terms of what their defense can bring to the table in this game, because I don't necessarily think this game is going to be as high scoring as some people might have expected. The next game is going to be kind of a microcosm of this game. It's going to be a very gritty game, divisional game that I really think a lot of people might not get a lot of answers from in terms of fantasy implications. That's Saints-Falcons. And the reason why this game is so intriguing in terms of fantasy implications is because you're not going to take much from it, right? Because this game could go either way. I think what you want to see out of this game is the things that have been working for this both of these offenses to work in this game as well, because it's a divisional game. Let's say you have Rashid Shaheed and you really think he's a viable wide receiver too for your fantasy team. You want to see him and Derek Carr connecting a couple of deep balls. If you own Alvin Kamara, you want to see him continue to be the focal point of that Saints offense. And if you're an owner of, say, Drake London or Bijan Robinson, you want Bijan Robinson's touches to warrant more yardage, and you want Drake London to continue being a threat all over the field, whether it be on early downs or in the red zone, because that's the things that have worked for the Saints and the Falcons thus far. And if they don't work in this game, expect this game to be a snooze fest, especially in terms of fantasy perspective. Because if this game plays out like your typical NFC South game, nothing can be made of stats-wise any way any of these players can affect your team, because it's gritty then it's not like you're going to learn much about who you want on your roster rather than, it being a slugfest because it's a divisional game. So this is like a weird one because I'm excited to see how both these offenses look in a divisional game. Because it's a divisional game, I'm not placing too much weight and emphasis on any fallout from underperformance, if that makes sense, from this game. But this game is still one that I'm kind of keep an eye on and monitor to see who might be the best performers from it. But the last game, this game obviously should have been on this list immediately. It's not a biased thing, I promise, but this game is perhaps the biggest one in terms of not just fantasy implications, but NFC implications, prove-it implications, and things of that nature. It's Seahawks-Lions. And this quote-unquote NFC rivalry really has been one of the most entertaining to watch over the past couple of years. And I know what you guys are thinking. This game seems like it could be more of a mismatch than people think because the Lions just feel like they have more weapons at their disposal right now, and it feels like this could be their coming out party, whereas the Seahawks look very depleted on the offensive side of the football, and their defense hasn't really been tested up to this point. That just adds to the quote-unquote pageantry of this game. It just adds more intrigue, more hype to see which players will step up. Because through 3 weeks, yes, the Seattle offense hasn't had its full bill of health at its disposal, but it still has found different weapons that it can utilize. For example, Jack Smith-Njigba is off to a pretty good start, and Zach Charbonnet had one of his best games as a Seahawk last week. And on the Lions side of things, you got to appreciate the fact that guys like David Montgomery and John Gibbs are getting so many touches as running backs who last year may have been hindered by the overall versatility of the Lions offense. But this game, expect both of these offenses to come out guns a-blazing. Not necessarily the Seahawks. I think that in terms of guns a-blazing, I mean more dink and dunk, trying to get the short to intermediate areas of the field exploited. And for the Lions, I expect Jared Goff to look himself again. I expect him to hit all areas of the field. I expect him to utilize Amon-Ra St. Brown more. We'll have to see if Sam Laporta looks good for this game to start. But overall, it's going to be a fun game. Expect the shootout. Expect high fantasy numbers all around by all skill position players concerned. But let me know what you think in the comments, because there are certainly a lot of games I could have missed that you guys might have wanted to talk about. But that'll just about do it for this opening segment. Coming up next, we take a little respite from our implications in terms of games around the NFL and college football to look at some high-risk, high-reward players for your fantasy squad for this upcoming week. You definitely don't want to miss. We'll be right back after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. Some losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back yet again to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Hope you guys enjoyed that first segment. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network. It is greatly appreciated by all involved. And also, you guys have been doing a great job with this as well. Keep on making yourselves available to the Super Chat. Super Thanks and Super Streakers features here on YouTube. Great way to communicate with the show. Great way to get your questions, comments, and concerns on air. So if you do feel so inclined throughout the show, it is greatly appreciated by me and a great way to make this show as interactive and exciting and hype as possible. Without further ado, let's get right into our second segment of the day here on today's show, talking about some high-risk, high-reward players for this weekend. The 5 guys that I've compiled from my list for this week as Andre enters the chat. I hope that these guys really can sustain positive kind of glimmers of optimism we've seen from them over the past couple of weeks, because these are guys, like I said, boomer bust guys. These guys you can't necessarily trust every given week. But I think that in terms of matchups, in terms of what we've seen from them throughout the season, I feel confident that they're good for at least a couple of good games a year at certain positions in fantasy. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Let's start at the quarterback position, and this guy certainly seems to fall in the category of people who play it safe at the position. He's not necessarily the most explosive of guys, but this past game really goes to show, as Andre asked a good question, is Garrett Wilson and Godwin for Justin Jefferson worth it? I think that it's an interesting trade because you're really asking the question, is 2 really high-end, borderline wide receiver 1 in fantasy guys worth a superstar level wide receiver 1 in this situation? And I think that in terms of what that means for your fantasy team, you're getting guys who can supplement each other very well for Justin Jefferson, who just supplements your entire team. But at the end of the day, the reason why I don't think it's worth it is because when I look at Justin Jefferson, he's just someone who is so special at the wide receiver position that he counts for 2 players. And this is not an indictment of Garrett Wilson and Chris Godwin, but when I looked at them this year, Godwin was off to a good start, but he has calmed down, and I think the Bucs really are paper tigers on both sides of the football, or starting to become paper tigers on both sides of the football. And Garrett Wilson right now, he has room to grow, but he really hasn't necessarily translated his former success to what this present-day Jets team is becoming. And so I feel like it's too big a risk to risk it all on a superstar player, even though, the Vikings offense is starting to become more about the sum of its parts than just Jefferson. I feel like right now it's just too big a risk to risk it all on 2 guys who really are starting to lose a little bit of fantasy value right now. But I hope that makes sense to you, and I hope that you can take that advice with you into your trade here. But I do want to get into a little bit of some high-risk, high-reward players, starting off with Justin Fields, the guy who I was mentioning a bit earlier. As Andre says, I then have Jamar Chase, Jefferson, and Olave. So that kind of pretty much proves, because that's perhaps one of the more solid wide receiver rooms in fantasy you could potentially have. Yes, I have my concerns about Jamar Chase, but he seems all right. He seems to be over the contract situation, and the Bengals have some manageable games on their schedule coming up to get back into the thick of the AFC. Talks about Jefferson, and Olave rounds it out very nicely. I think that he's always good for a couple of good games in terms of having him as either a flex or a wide receiver 3 on your bench. But in terms of high-risk, high-reward players and Justin Fields, he's someone who I feel like makes sense in a deeper league, but if you are in, say, a smaller league, he's going to be an interesting play. As Tap to Learn mentions that Andre has a couple of studs in his team, and I completely agree. The thing about Justin Fields is that I don't know if last week's game was a harbinger of things to come, but it certainly showed he's growing and maturing as a quarterback. And in terms of fantasy, it might be a little bit too late to put so much weight on a player of his status, but he is showing some moxie at the position. And for those of you who may have underestimated the depth of the QB market and are kind of struggling at the position right now, Justin Fields is someone you can monitor week in, week out. I also like him in terms of a dynasty perspective. I don't necessarily know how long this whole Justin Fields as a Steelers quarterback thing is going to go on, because I still think Russell Wilson could have a say in this QB room, albeit he's running out of time and he's on a short leash in that regard. But at the end of the day, Justin Fields could be someone who could be a sneaky play in the future, more long-term than short-term in fantasy. So he's just someone to kind of monitor. This matchup this week could be one that he could be someone in a top 15 situation in terms of the QB position. And then let's go to the wide receiver position, because there are a lot of players who I've kind of been disappointed in and want to see more out of. And there are a lot of players who have kind of exceeded expectations, but I'm kind of wary of. This guy kind of falls somewhere in the middle, and that is DJ Moore. He's going up against the Rams this week. I personally have him on my fantasy team, and I can tell you how topsy-turvy he has been. Last week, there was a little bit of optimism there, a little bit of glimmer of hope. He had 8 catches, 78 yards, and 1 TD in that game against Indy. And this week, he's going up against a Rams defense that really isn't as threatening as it can be in the post-Donald era. So look for the Bears' offense to remain a unit that is competent enough to string together a couple of good drives. But all things considered, he's not going to have one of those games where he's going to really break out. I think that as long as the Bears are going to continue to find their way, he will find his way as well. Because Caleb right now is in a situation where he's starting to learn more about this wide receiver room, and thus he's going to try and implement as many of his top receivers as possible. So week in, week out, DJ Moore is going to be someone whose numbers are going to be very Jekyll and Hyde, if you get what I mean, in that kind of offense. So look for DJ Moore to week in, week out be someone who is a matchups-oriented player, and this matchup could pretend to favor him. And then another receiver who I'm kind of intrigued by, but not really because of the nature of this offense, is Demario Douglas. He had a pretty impressive performance against the New York Jets, but then again, any performance, as Andre said, the Bears need to fire Shane Waldron. He's just horrible. Trust me, Andre, as a Seattle Seahawks fan who had to live through his tenure as our OC for several years, I get that point. I think that he is just very weird in how he interprets an offense, an NFL offense at that. And yes, you can also blame the Bears' offensive line issues and things of that nature, but he's really not impacting Caleb in a positive way. He's really not necessarily focused on getting the ball quickly out of his hands, because I think that this wide receiver room, if there's one thing that's kind of underrated about them, or underestimated about them, is their ability to have yards after the catch. Yes, a lot of them kind of tend to be more vertical guys, or guys who, as Andre also says, dude, I didn't believe it at first, but seeing the plays he calls in the red zone, it's like, what the hell is he doing? I completely understand you, because, yeah, he's not getting the best out of the traits these Bears wide receivers possess. Like Rome Odunze can be great in the red zone. As KJ Frederick, welcome to you, and it's the chat as well. If Dell and Nico Collins are out, should I shoot my shot with Schultz, my tight end spot? Full PPR. Well, I haven't necessarily heard that much about the Texas injury report. I have heard more about Dell and the concerns with him. I'm not sure what is going on with Nico Collins, but the reason why I think that I'm going to say no to shooting your shot with Schultz is because this offense really is more predicated around getting Joe Mixon involved. Yes, he might be out of this game as well, but if he does play this game, Joe Mixon's going to have more of a say in it in terms of the run-to-pass philosophy this offense is starting to bring in. And so I don't know how Dalton Schultz is going to be affected by that. I'm not sure he's going to get as many targets as people think, because last year they did not have a running back as talented as Mixon. But then again, if both Dell and Collins are projecting to be out, then he could be a big play. You still have Diggs in that offense, and CJ Stroud might look to him a little bit more often. But, it's an interesting question. I'm going to say no for now just because of the nature of this Texans offense. But in the future, he could be a nice little matchups-oriented piece for you. But I hope that helps, at least for this week. Getting back to Andre's point, I kind of want to mention that as well. The Bears really are in a weird spot. But I really hope that DJ Moore is there. Before we go to take a quick break, I want to quickly go through what these guys that we kind of lost a little bit of time for. Demario Douglas, make of his performance from last week as you will. Going up against a 49ers defense that I'm not as scared of with all the injury problems that it's going through. Javon Hargrave is going to be out. Nick Bosa has been struggling with injury. They still are weakened in the secondary. So potentially the Patriots could have an opportunity to pass more often than they have in the past couple of weeks. So look for Demario Davis to maybe build on that strong performance at the very least by one Patriots wide receiver. And then Jalen Naylor is a guy who is kind of a deep sleeper in a lot of leagues, but going up against the Packers team that you're really going to have to diversify your pass attack for because of the strength of their secondary. So I think that Justin Jefferson will have a big game, but I want Sam Darnold to continue to try to spread the ball around to confuse this Packers secondary. And not for nothing, Jalen Naylor is one of those guys who he's not going to put up many yards, but he can be a very nice little red zone threat for the Vikings in that offense. And the last but not least, how about Quentin Johnston? This will really depend on if Justin Herbert plays, but he still has been performing better than last season when he was a rookie. As Andre says, go Pack, go. We're humbling Minnesota. That is your ultimate opinion. I think it's going to be a very good game. I think that it's going to be closer, though, than a lot of people expect, but I will give the Pack the edge if, like you said yesterday, Jordan Love plays. But at the end of the day, I think Jalen Naylor could be a nice, sneaky X factor in this game for Minnesota at the very least. But then Quentin Johnston against the Chiefs, it is going to be highly dependent on if Justin Herbert plays. But, for what it's worth, he has been playing better than what we saw from him last year. Already has more touchdowns than he did all of last year. So if, Justin Herbert throws the ball more often in this game as he's trying to play catch-up with the Chiefs, then I could see a potential big game for Quentin Johnston. But like I said, monitor that Justin Herbert's injury at all costs. But that will just about do it for this segment. Let me know what you think of my high-risk, high-reward players in the comments. As Andre says, Addison's back too. They have a crazy receiving core in Minnesota. Yeah, I completely agree. And they're also missing Hawkinson at the tight end position as well. So bring it all together, and they could be building something there in Minnesota that's quite special. But we do have to take a quick break. When we come back on the other side, we're looking ahead to Sunday Night Football. We don't necessarily get to talk about Sunday Night Football as we're not a weekend show as often, so I wanted to get that in. But we'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. For our third segment of the show here on today's edition, we are looking at Sunday Night Football. I wanted to look ahead to this game, perhaps the best game of the entire weekend. We don't necessarily get to talk about it as often, as we're not a weekend show to be around to talk about Sunday Night Football. But since it's a nice matchup in the AFC between two juggernauts looking to kind of maintain a dominant force of nature in the AFC, I think that's going to be an interesting game that I want to look at before, the show leaves for the weekend and comes back Monday. So without further ado, let's jump right into our third segment of the day here. In terms of this game, Bills-Ravens, like I said, marquee matchup. Kind of talked about it a little bit in the first segment, but I think that ultimately this game is going to be about pride for both of these teams. For Baltimore, they're going to want to come out swinging because they don't want to lose their pride in going 1-3 in the very tough AFC North, albeit an AFC North that's kind of weird right now. The Steelers are 3-0. The Browns are a dumpster fire. The Bengals are at risk potentially of going 0-4. They're 0-3 right now. And then the Ravens as well, kind of, in a weird position where they could be in a situation where they'd be at least 2-1 or 3-0, but a couple of plays don't go their way. They give up that win against the Raiders. And yeah, they're just a very weird, fickle team right now. On the Bills side of things, they look like my potential Super Bowl contender, if you want my honest opinion, from the AFC because of the way their offense is playing, like we mentioned in that first segment. I love how Josh Allen looks like now. As Andre says, playing Gibbs and Kyren this week, I'm nervous. Well, as someone who also doesn't have fantastic depth at the running back position, I feel you, my man. But their matchups are very intriguing, right? Because Gibbs against that Seahawks interior kind of might have a favorable matchup. It is all about touches. I understand that, and it seems like Montgomery's going to get a little bit more in that regard. But Gibbs at least will not have to face Byron Murphy or Leonard Williams. I don't necessarily know as much about Leonard Williams playing, but I do know that Byron Murphy will be out of that game. So as long as the Lions' run game is still relied upon, I think, though, that they are going to switch a little bit more to the pass game to try and frustrate Seattle in that regard. But Gibbs still is someone who I might be intrigued to see play out. And Kyren, he's going against the Bears defense, not necessarily the best run defense, but at the end of the day, they are still a very feisty, opportunistic one. So it depends on how they utilize him, because as a pass catcher, he's going to add a lot of value, because I don't necessarily think the Rams rely that much right now on any one receiver over a guy like Kyren Williams. So that could help him in that regard, but I get what you're coming from, because both of those defensive matchups could be very daunting for both of those running backs. But going back to this Bills-Ravens game, on the Bills side of things, talking about how their offense is really becoming a juggernaut. I really like I said, Joe Brady and what he's done for this offense. But at the end of the day, it really is going to come down to, as Andre also mentions, Gibson PPR just scares me. He can score a rushing and receiving touchdown. Yeah, I mean, in PPR as well, I feel like Gibbs, is one of those boomer bust guys week in, week out right now, where his capabilities, but it's just that the Lions' offense is an enigma right now. As Andre also mentions, what do I do with Garrett Wilson? Josh Allen for MVP. Right now, I agree with that MVP pick. But in terms of Garrett Wilson, yeah, man, I don't really know what to say about him, because I, for what it's worth, am trying to keep my cool with him. I'm keeping him on my fantasy team for as long as possible, waiting for that breakout game. But I sincerely don't know when it will come, because, as I said before, Aaron Rodgers seems to be honed in on the players who he likes, and that's Lazard, and that's Conklin, and that's the players who can get open for him. Right now, it seems like he doesn't necessarily trust the overall structure of this offense and what it could be if he kind of utilizes Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall to positive effect. So that could lead to his detriment, but I'm still holding out hope for Garrett Wilson in this offense. Like you said, Josh Allen's playing MVP level football for this Bills team. Let's look at the betting preview, because it spells a different story here. Baltimore, a pretty surprising 2.5-point favorite. Even at home, yes, I understand the home advantage for them can be a positive thing, but I would still say that Bills deserve to be the favorites in this game for what they've done for the past couple of weeks. The over-under is 46.5. The money line's Baltimore minus 135. Buffalo plus 115. So as you can see, it is kind of one of those betting lines where you feel like the odds makers let you down in terms of who you believe is the deserved favorite, but it's still kind of a viable betting market as well. You can't just ignore the fact that even though the Bills might be the more deserving team in terms of the betting line, you still have to understand the whole context of the game as well. And I think that this game will be more even than people think. I think that if Lamar is timely with his legs and the Baltimore offensive line holds up, then I think that we could be having a nice little shootout of a game here. But at the current moment in time, I trust the Bills' offense a lot more than I trust the Ravens, just because of the comfortability Josh Allen is playing with, just because of the fact that you really can't necessarily account for one specific player in that Bills offense and say, if we lock him down, we have a better chance, because Josh Allen will just find the open guy. He'll find Khalil Shakir if you lock down Dalton Kincaid. He'll find Dalton Kincaid if you lock down Keon Coleman. You'll find James Cook in the screen game if you lock down, say, Ty Johnson. He just has so many ways to utilize this offense to the best of his abilities, so many ways to keep it on schedule that I just can't for the life of me find out a way or an offensive game plan for the Ravens to slow it down. And speaking of the defenses, yes, both of them have major concerns, but what the Bills' defense has been able to do is limit the pass game. And right now, the Ravens' pass game, I can't necessarily say is at its best right now. I have very little faith, and we'll talk about this in my Stardom Cinema segment coming up next, in the ability to utilize guys like Zay Flowers and Isaiah Likely down the field if this offensive line doesn't hold up. I have faith in Lamar Jackson's escapability. I have faith that he will try and keep this offense on schedule. And I potentially will start to have more faith in Derrick Henry as well as an option out of the backfield. But for now, I feel like if you don't really have a passing game, you don't really have anything to threaten the Bills' defense with. That being said, that could play into the hands of Derrick Henry, and he could pretend to have a big game. But at this current moment in time, I'm giving the slight advantage to the Bills' defense and their kind of task ahead of them, and the Ravens' defense in terms of trying to slow down the many different weapons that Josh Allen has at his disposal. But in terms of how I'm leaning in this game, I think that the Bills should win outright, but Baltimore is going to keep it close. I am kind of shocked at the spread in terms of, what we've seen from both of these teams. But it is a liable spread. I'm not going to shy away from it just because, I think the Ravens got the luck of the draw here undeservedly. I'm going to say that I'm saying this with my chest and saying that the Bills will win outright, and I'm confident in that pick. But at the current moment right now, I wouldn't be shocked if, Baltimore, with timely opportunistic plays, kept themselves in it. Now, it's going to be a tough task, and as long as, Lamar Jackson keeps himself upright, I can see a game where Baltimore might take this outright and cover the spread. But it's going to be, like I said, very difficult if you have a very limited pass game. So I think the game plan for the Ravens, let's start with them, is going to have to come down to Lamar Jackson's timeliness and decision making. If he's confident with his legs, confident in stretching the field, stretching the linebackers, and making them uncomfortable on the Bills side of things, then they might have a chance. But, if the Bills are doing a good job of generating pressure, Lamar's having to create a structure, then I start to worry about what the Baltimore offense will look like, because this O-line we've already seen time and time again can't keep up. On the Bills side of things, I just think that Josh Allen has to continue being Josh Allen. Continue being the guy who we've seen for the past 3 weeks. Continue being the guy who, like Audrey says, is right now the top MVP candidate. And I think that he'll be fine. In terms of who I want to see on this offense step up, I don't think anyone needs to step up as much as continue doing what is asked of them. Continue making themselves available for Josh Allen, because at the end of the day, I wouldn't be mad at any Bills from a fantasy perspective, actually, if all of them have very similar stat lines. And it's been the case through the past couple of weeks. So as long as the Bills, utilize their offense to the best of their abilities, Josh Allen plays like himself, then I think the Bills should easily win this. But like I said, the Ravens' game plan is all down to Lamar Jackson. And he, as well as Allen, are two of the best dual-threat quarterbacks in the league. So no matter what, this could be a very fun game. But it's going to be all about timeliness. As Andre says, who are some receivers you would trade Garrett Wilson for? I think that's a very interesting question because Garrett Wilson is such a hard receiver to kind of diagnose in terms of importance, whether he be, someone who you're thinking about starting in your wide receiver 1 position or someone who's a wide receiver 2 flex kind of option for you. But I would say, since your wide receiver room is so fantastic, you could have an opportunity to either, take Garrett Wilson week by week, keep him on your bench, either drop him or trade him as the week goes on, and see how a guy like Jawan Jennings pans out. Because Jawan Jennings, like I said when I was talking about him in terms of him being on the waiver wire and him now stepping into a bigger role for San Fran, I actually think that this can be maintained throughout the year, no matter who's, as Andre said, he's my wide receiver 2 in a 3-receiver league full PPR. So again, I say if you don't value him as someone who you expect week in, week out to put up big numbers, and he's hovering somewhere around your wide receiver 2 to wide receiver 3 or on your bench, then you can take a flyer on him in the next couple of weeks and pick up a guy like Jawan Jennings, because Jawan Jennings seems like he's not an aberration. He's not someone who's going to disappear once pieces for the 49ers offense comes back. So that's someone who I would monitor, but it is a big risk because Garrett Wilson at the end of the day still would add more value, I believe, than Jawan Jennings to the Jets if Aaron Rodgers starts to utilize him more. So I would still keep him for now, is my advice, but week in, week out, if you see that there's a pattern in the ineffectiveness that he's being in this Jets offense, then I would say either trade him, drop him, and pick up a guy like Jennings, if Jennings is either on a team or still out there by that point. But that's probably the best advice I can give you, because he is going to be a very weird wide receiver to monitor throughout the year. But my final statements in terms of this Bills-Ravens game is that it's going to be a shootout. There's going to be a lot of nice little fantasy options, but that will be a perfect segue to my next segment after the quick break we're going to be about to take. We will be looking at the stardom sit-em options for Sunday Night Football. Who do I think will shine, as Andre says he's worth potentially benching this week? Well, I think they're in a positive matchup. So, actually, as Andre says, bad matchup versus Surtain. Yeah, I think that you can justify doing that, even though we know the sum of the parts of the Broncos defense isn't as good as Pat Surtain's alone. As Tactical Learner says, if Wilson gains Rodgers' trust, watch out. Then again, it's all about Aaron Rodgers more than it is about Aaron Wilson. If Aaron Rodgers, wants to throw to his guys, Rodgers will throw to his guys. But he still has Wilson as an option. And that's all I can give you. But we do have to take a quick break. On the other side, we're looking at some stardom sit-em options, like I said, for Sunday Night Football. We'll be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. Hope you guys enjoyed that last segment. We were also going to be looking not just at Sunday Night Football from a betting perspective, but from a fantasy perspective, and look at some of the stardom sit-em options for this game for you guys. And I think this one is pretty clear-cut. You guys might be a little mad at me for some of the things I'm going to say here compared to what I was saying positively about the Ravens in that previous segment. But this was my ultimate opinion from what I thought of the matchup, just because of, how both of these teams' trajectories have been throughout the season. So without further ado, let's talk about my options. the obvious start here, at least from a QB perspective, is Josh Allen. I would say Josh Allen, out of all the players playing in that game, is the one who I would say you should pencil in immediately as your starting quarterback, should you have him. 30.92 fantasy points last week against Jacksonville. And yes, a lot of people are going to say, well, the Jacksonville defense is worse, much worse than the Baltimore defense. Well, the Baltimore defense really hasn't been good at generating pressure. It really hasn't been good in terms of generating takeaways. So I say to that, well, while they are kind of better than the Jacksonville defense, they're not necessarily going to really hurt or hinder Josh Allen in this offense. I mean, if anything, I think that Josh Allen's going to be willing to exploit the Ravens secondary a lot more. I know that they have a lot of injuries in that part of their defense, and Josh Allen will be chomping at the bit to kind of exploit that. But at the end of the day, I'm not as scared of the Ravens defense as I was last year, and I'm not scared of them in this matchup especially. So Josh Allen, look for him to have a big day yet again against the Baltimore Ravens. And then in terms of sitting, I talked about this guy a little bit, Zay Flowers. He really has not necessarily shown me much as a fantasy receiver or as a real-life receiver for this Ravens offense. You can say it's through no fault of his own. You can say it's offensive line issues. You can say it's the fact that out of structure, the Ravens really don't necessarily have much of a game plan. But whatever it is that you are thinking of in terms of the reason why Zay Flowers isn't performing to the standards we hold him to, I just think that he's not someone who I would even consider as a matchup guy. He's losing his value week in, week out in this offense. I just feel like Lamar starting to trust players like Justice Hill and Isaiah Likely a little bit more. I feel like that's the way this offense is orienting, and that's what it's becoming a little bit more of. And if the offensive line woes continue, then I don't see a path to where that connection gets revitalized, if you want me to be honest with you. I think that right now, Zay Flowers is someone who is quickly falling down tiers to where he's almost undesirable by anyone. So he's going to be my first sit here for this game. So another start, almost all Bills here, James Cook. And this is not my bias of him being one of my better players on my personal fantasy team, but he has just been a revelation for this Bills offense because of the many ways they can utilize him. They love him as a workhorse back. They love him as a guy who can occasionally break off and get that explosive play for you. They love him in the screen game. They love him in so many different ways, and it's paying dividends for them. And as long as Josh Allen can trust him in that backfield, James Cook will continue to get a lot of touches, continue to put up a lot of yards. Maybe not as many yards as some other guys in that offense just because they have so many mouths to feed. But James Cook is just someone who at the end of the day is a solid fantasy running back. He's someone who you might not have expected as your RB1 or liking as your RB1 to start the year. But in my personal opinion, he has been paying dividends for my offense, my fantasy offense, in terms of being that RB1 that I so desperately wanted. And he's really making up for the deficiencies in my fantasy running back room as DeAndre Swift is continuing to fail me, as Andre is asking advice for his own fantasy football lineup. Josh Allen, Jordan Mason, Kenneth Walker, Jamar Chase, Olave, Godwin, Kelsey, flex David Montgomery, or should I drop Godwin for Wilson? I really like this lineup in fantasy this week. I really do. Monitor the K9 situation if you know he's in your flex. Well, actually, he's not in your flex, but that's for another day. But I really like this lineup. I think that, your wide receiver's pretty strong. I wouldn't necessarily imagine Jamar Chase will struggle against a Panthers defense that just beat up on the Raiders. I mean, it's the Raiders. So I would expect Jamar Chase to have a pretty good game. Olave could be a tense situation, but he could be a big difference maker in that game, which would be a very gritty physical game. As Andre also says he has Charbonnet in case K9 doesn't play. Well, the thing about Charbonnet is he's a very high-risk, high-reward player. Like, he might not get as much yardage as you would like, but he is someone who can get the occasional touchdown, so he's someone who's going to be a very interesting player to monitor, especially in this week's game against Detroit. But the rest of this lineup, Josh Allen, like I said, I would pencil him in if he were my starting quarterback immediately. Mason, as always, really proving to be an apt replacement for Christian McCaffrey in that San Fran offense. Did have kind of a down day against LA, but that was just Jawan Jennings' game to shine. But overall, I really like this option. In terms of dropping Godwin for Wilson, yeah, I would say, as Andre said, Charbonnet in the goal line, I trust him to get in the end zone 9 out of 10 times. Yeah, but in certain situations in the open field, I wouldn't necessarily say so as a Seattle fan. But at the end of the day, I really like this lineup. In terms of the Godwin for Wilson question, I will say this. The Jets-Broncos matchup overall seems like a better matchup. But like you said, going up against Surtain, who's already faced some of the better wide receivers in this league, in DK, in Mike Evans, and doing what he has done really gives me pause. Whereas Godwin going up against, who are they playing this week? The Buccaneers. I'm blanking on the matchup for them, but I think that, Godwin's going to have a better day just based off the matchups alone. So I would say Godwin has a safe place in that lineup for now. But week in, week out, Godwin and Wilson are two guys who, like I said, are very matchups oriented. But in terms of this game, I want to get back to a guy who I think that you might want to sit, as Andre said, I sent the MHJ owner an offer of Olave and Ridley. See, I like MHJ a lot, and I think that he's going to continue to grow in this Arizona offense. I don't think he's worth two players who can get you the same in their respective roles than just one MHJ. Because MHJ, like I said, is someone who I really value in that Arizona offense, but he's going to have a lot of boom or bust games because they have to find their footing. As Andre also mentions, his team was insane when he made a terrible trade before Week 11. Or Week 1, I traded Cook and Rice for Olave and Pacheco. And it's not as terrible a trade as you think, but seeing as to how I have seen Cook and Rice become very valuable fantasy assets on my own team, I could see why you're miffed by that. But like I said, it's not as terrible. Yes, the Pacheco injury, but Olave I kind of feel like is one of those receivers who week in, week out, you can semi-rely upon to put up good fantasy numbers for you. That's just me. I think that the team that you have shown me for your lineup for this week, as Tap to Learn gives me the matchup Bucks home to Eagles. So, again, both of those games are games that you feel like the wide receivers might not have as favorable matchups, but I still think Godwin will have a favorable matchup as Baker loves playing the Eagles, and I think that he's going to want to pass the football early and often in this game. That's just my opinion. It's ultimately, as Andre said, I didn't expect Cook to get this many goal line carries this year. I didn't even really expect him to get as many open field carries this year, or be relied upon in so many different situations in the open field for the Bills. I expected him to be kind of more of a workman-like guy who on early downs would just set the tone for the offense, and Josh Allen would just spread the ball around in late down situations. But no, he's been used in a lot of different situations, especially at, like you said, the goal line. So, yeah, he's really paid dividends for me in my personal fantasy team. It kind of sucks that you decide to trade him away pretty early, but it is what it is in fantasy football sometimes, and you just got to roll with the punches. But that team that you just showed me with all these fantastic players should have a pretty good week. You just have to balance it out, watch true for injuries. As Andre says, his usage is just completely different this year. I should have assumed it knowing they lost Diggs. Well, you could have also assumed that potentially Brady could have said, well, we want to keep kind of the same structure we had with Diggs, just, utilizing more pieces. And that's another thing that they've done so well. As Andre said, he was surprised Allen is still doing this good without Diggs. Some people were worried. I'm actually not surprised. I'm one of those people who kind of expected Allen to be much more comfortable in this role. as, losing Diggs, losing the tension that comes with having a guy who demands the football so much in your team really would elevate his status. And also the addition of Joe Brady. I really like what he's done. I can't preach his name enough. I can't sing his praise enough for what he's done with the Bills' offense thus far. He's going to be tested later in the season. They're going to have a lot of touch matchups, especially in the East, in that division. But I've liked what he's done so far. So I'm not necessarily surprised. It's just that I feel like it's more of a relaxed approach where Allen doesn't feel like he has to account for Diggs as much too. And then for James Cook, in terms of his usage, it's just that I feel like it's not necessarily a losing Diggs thing. It's more of becoming more versatile, if that makes sense. It makes sense to utilize your running back more in a short passing game if you know your quarterback has had troubles with turnover issues, but you can still utilize that deep ball. I feel like by Josh Allen using James Cook kind of as a screen guy or in the goal line more, as Andre kind of reiterates the same way by saying Allen loves this team because they don't care who gets the ball. I agree. I feel like as long as they stay on schedule, as long as the tempo of this offense feels right, I'm not concerned about it. But thank you for your comments. We actually do have to take a quick break. I did not get through all of my stardom cinema, unfortunately. But right after the break, we actually take a little bit of a respite from the NFL and look ahead to the exciting college football games that I believe will have huge fantasy implications if there are any fantasy college football fans out there as well. So we'll be right back after that short break in order to talk about that. Hello everyone and welcome back to our final segment of the day here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. But before we get into that final segment, we do come back to a comment yet again from Andre, who is asking a very, very tough question of me right now. Who are your top 5 quarterbacks in order? Well, here's the thing. This year has proven that any quarterback on any given Sunday can perform well across a very small sample size. So I can say that I can sit here and give you guys who have performed this season in terms of the small sample size we've seen in them and give that kind of top 5 from this season. But I'm going to give you my top 5 guys in terms of who I thought coming into the season would be the top guys. And I don't necessarily think it will change that much because these are all guys who I rely on week in, week out. But the top kind of has changed for me a little bit because of what I've seen from this season, but it's still kind of similar to what I would have said coming into the season, had you asked me a bit earlier. So, number 1 right now is actually Josh Allen. This was kind of bolstered by what I've seen from him so far, but at the end of the day, he's proving that losing Stephon Diggs does not matter. He's proving that team mentality always comes first. And he's just shining in this offense under Joe Brady. I'm still going to put Mahomes at number 2. He is, like he said himself, he's not playing his best football at this current moment, but he still adds so much value to that team. And he's worth at least 4 or 5 wins this Chiefs squad. Without him, I don't know how this Chiefs squad would look. Then I'm going to say Lamar Jackson, just because of his dual threat ability. He's kind of in a similar situation to Mahomes where he's asked to do more in this offense. Maybe not to the extent that Mahomes is, but just because of his dual threat ability and his ability to keep this team competitive despite all the offensive line deficiencies they faced this year, I still think Jackson warrants a top 5 selection. This is where it's kind of going to get dicey a little bit. And number 4, I got to throw Hurts in there. And you can criticize me for this pick because of the turnovers, because of the decision making that kind of fall into his lap due to Sirianni. But I think that the reason why a lot of people love Hurts so much is because of the fact that, taking away all the offensive scheming and things of that nature in the world of football, Jalen Hurts, if you were to just offer him to someone as a guy who would kickstart your franchise without knowing about him, or just want to take a flyer on him, he would pay dividends. If Sirianni, weren't necessarily quote-unquote holding him back as much, then I would say Jalen Hurts would potentially rival some of these top 3 guys. And the last guy, this is tough because, as Tapton says, Purdy will rise, and maybe not as high as top 5. But the last guy I will take a lot of flack for. It's just that I believe in him with this offense. I believe in his capabilities in this offense. I got to go Jared Goff. Yes, based off these past 3 games, you can say that he should not be anywhere near the top 5. But there's just something about the style of play in Ben Johnson's offense that gives me hope in what he can be as the season progresses. We saw last year what he was in that offense for a full year. And this is just kind of the intricacies of Ben Johnson's offense coming into play as well, where they can be confident if Jared Goff does not play up to snuff in running the football. But when he does, look for him to put up big numbers and warrant that top 5 selection. That's my personal top 5. Ultimately, it's not the best, I know, but it's the one that I feel like is most comprehensive to me at this current point, irregardless of what we've seen from all the quarterbacks in the league thus far. But I do want to take a little bit of a respite from the NFL and transition to my last segment, as Tap to Learn says CJ Stroud belongs up there. Well, the thing about CJ Stroud, right, is that you kind of feel like what his strengths are, and how confident he feels in that DeMeco Ryans-led team, but then that his weaknesses are really, really flawed weaknesses once he plays a competent defense. So I love CJ Stroud, but his weaknesses are so glaring when you see them, which albeit they are rare, but when you do see them, they are very, very glaring in terms of some other guys here, because the other guys on that list I feel like can make up for the errors they can make in that offense, and also because their offenses are so strong that any one of them at any given time can mitigate for any mistakes. Whereas CJ Stroud, yes, he has one of the best teams in the league. It's just that I'm not confident in placing him amongst players who can more easily mitigate for their mistakes and not get completely overwhelmed by certain teams. So I love CJ Stroud, respect him, but maybe he's on the periphery right now. But I do want to get into the world of college football, as much as I appreciate all these comments and much as I appreciate all these debates. Talk about some of the interesting games in terms of fantasy implications there. Let's start off with perhaps the biggest game of the weekend, perhaps in all of sports. Yes, we talked a lot about the NFL games that will matter this week, but this game perhaps is the marquee matchup across any sport this weekend, and that is Georgia-Alabama. Actually, I do have Illinois-Penn State, but we will skip that for this game's purpose. I think that this game does take precedence over Illinois-Penn State for as much fun as that game's going to be for now. Really quickly, I'm going to go through this. We only have about 4 minutes left in the show. I think that this game is really going to come down to which QB steps up. More importantly, which quarterback performs better at their specific trait level than the other guy, if that makes sense. For Carson Beck, it's just staying on schedule. He's not, from a fantasy perspective, the sexiest option for you out there, but he's just a timely, opportunistic guy who's going to stay on schedule. In terms of the weapons that UGA has, they really haven't necessarily stepped up, but that could lead to their success in this game. Because Alabama really doesn't know that much about who could be the biggest weapon for UGA in this game. It could be Dominic Lovett. It could be Dylan Bell. It could be their running back, Trevor Etienne. It could be any of those guys, and that could play into, in terms of a fantasy perspective, a lot of different options you could be looking at. But if Carson Beck just stays in schedule, that will be the best possible story for Georgia. In terms of Jalen Milroe, if you just took this matchup face value and didn't necessarily care about anyone else and just said, pick these two quarterbacks, it would be Jalen Milroe from a fantasy perspective, just because of the explosiveness he offers at the QB position. But explosive plays don't necessarily translate to on-field success that much, because as much as they would love to keep that as an aspect of their offense, Georgia's defense is for real. As much as, their offensive deficiencies might come through in this game, this Georgia defense is very good at limiting the explosive play. And yes, Jalen Milroe is a very special kind of quarterback. He's done this before. That was under Nick Saban, though. And I feel like a lot of different weapons on Alabama can step up in this game, whether it be J.M. Miller, whether it be Ryan Williams, who's shown his explosiveness as a true freshman, one of the younger players in college football, mind you. I think that overall, this team can't necessarily hope and pray that every single drive is going to end in explosive play down the field. Because as much as that would be a more exciting kind of aspect of the game, because it could open the game up more, you still have to beat a Georgia team that's going to want to control the football more than you. You have to consider that as well, because you don't necessarily want this game turning into a track meet, although it could play into your favor if you're Alabama. But at the end of the day, it's going to be about the QBs in this game. I think that if you're a fantasy football, college football especially enthusiast, this game is really going to speak to two different kind of quarterbacking philosophies. So look to that game. But let's go back to the Illinois-Penn State game for a little bit of time. It's going to be defense versus offense. It's going to be Drew Aller, who's been one of the more impressive QBs in the nation thus far under that new offensive scheme with Andy Kotelnicki at the helm. I think that, Illinois' defense is good enough to frustrate Penn State's offense for a nice period of time, but it's just that Penn State's offense has some of the best weapons in the game, especially in terms of a fantasy perspective as well. Omari Evans has really stepped up. Harrison Wallace. I really like the two-back tandem in Nicholas Singleton and Keyshawn Allen. Really haven't seen a lot of them this year, but that's just going to show how deep this offense has become. On the Illinois side of things, I think that this offense, it has some special players. Luke Altmaier has looked really good this year. Not necessarily asked to do too much in this offense, but I think that it just needs to stay on schedule. I like Caden Fagan in this game, can play a big role at the running back position. Ultimately, the marquee matchup for this game is defense versus offense. And the last game here, I kind of want to touch on before we have to end the show, is OK State, Kansas State. Big game in terms of the Big 12, in terms of which of these teams can emerge as a title contender to rival Utah in the Big 12. And a big question in terms of fantasy is whether or not, Ollie Gordon is still an RB1, but it's also about can, the players on both of these squads that are expected to step up really step up as well. Alan Bowman should have an interesting kind of game because he's not someone who I would rely upon as a fantasy QB in college football. And then on the other side of things, can Avery Johnson kind of wipe away the memories of that BYU game quickly enough to go into this game and be ready to be in attack mode for this Kansas City offense. But Ollie Gordon is the big question as well, because he's had a slow start, and I want to see more of him. But let me know what you think in the comments. That will just about do it for this show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Chris Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your great comments. Keep them coming for next week's shows as well, to make this show as interactive and exciting as possible. But also consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. But without further ado, I'm going to end the show right about here. But thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back next week. Same time as always, 3:30 p.m. Eastern, starting on Monday. But other than that, I am out.